Please don't split us up. Ruth Mercer said it with her back against the orphanage wall and both arms locked around her little sister so tightly that Lucy's shoes had come half off on the scuffed floorboards. The matron, Mrs. Vale, had one hand on Ruth's sleeve. The deputy had the other on Lucy's wrist. The room smelled of coal smoke, starch, and wet wool steaming by the stove. Lucy's face was buried against Ruth's neck, and the sound coming out of her was too small to be proper crying. It was the sound a child makes when she's trying to hold herself together with pure will. You told me we could stay together if I worked, Ruth said, her voice raw from repeating it. You said that plain. Mrs. Vale would not meet her eyes. I said I would try. In the doorway stood Gideon Pike with his silver watch chain across his vest and his gloves tucked neat beneath one arm. He sat on the county board, owned the feed store, loaned money at interest, and had the smooth patience of a man used to winning because everyone around him had long ago grown tired of resisting. Beside him, hat in hand and shoulders white with road dust, stood Caleb Hale, the rancher from west of Medicine Bow who had come in for a hired hand and found a room already breaking apart. Lucy lifted her blotched face. Please, she whispered to the stranger. Don't let him take me. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. One of the best things about stories like this is knowing who's beside the fire with us, whether it's a porch in Texas, a kitchen in Alberta, a small house in Yorkshire, or a quiet room in New South Wales. Deputy Harker tugged again. The little ones placed with Mrs. Bell and Laramie. The older girls going to the hotel laundry. That's the order. Ruth tightened her grip. She was 22, broad-shouldered, strong from work no one ever paid enough for, and had spent her whole life hearing some version of the same sentence. Too much girl, too much opinion, too much appetite, too much height, too hard to marry, too plain to save. She had learned to answer most of the world by setting her jaw and doing the work anyway. But this was Lucy. There was no calm left for losing Lucy. I can cook, Ruth said. I can sew plain enough. I can keep books if a man's got books worth keeping. Take both of us, or neither. Pike smiled without warmth. You are in no position to bargain. Caleb Hale finally spoke. His voice was low and weathered, like wood that had stayed standing through many winters. How old is the child? 10, Mrs. Vale said quickly. Hope moved through her so fast, it almost made her reckless. The older one's steady. Works hard. I thought perhaps. Pike cut in. You thought wrong. Mister. Hale needs one worker, not a pair of dependents. Lucy's fingers clawed at Ruth's collar. Ruth felt the heat of the child's tears through the thin cotton and understood, with a clarity that made her sick, that if she lost her now, she might never see her again. Plenty of promises in county offices never made it beyond the ink. Caleb looked at the iron bedstead propped against the far wall for whatever child came next. Then he looked at Ruth, who had gone still in the dangerous way people do when breaking would embarrass them, and then at Lucy, who had not taken her eyes off him. There's one bed at my place already, he said. Mrs. Vale inhaled. Then Ruth can. No, Caleb said. The room fell silent. Then he set his hat on his head, turned toward the door as if the matter were already solved, and said, I'll buy one extra bed. Even Pike blinked. Deputy Harker let go of Lucy's wrist. Mrs. Vale sat down, so suddenly the chair groaned under her. Ruth stared at Caleb as if he had spoken in another language. Pike recovered first. That is not how county placements are handled. Caleb's eyes met his. Nothing loud in them. Nothing flashy. Just a long, old steadiness. Seems it is now. Pike took one slow step into the room. Your note comes due in 2 weeks, Hale. I'd think careful on adding burdens. Ruth saw the hit land because Caleb's jaw tightened once. Debt, then. Trouble already circling him. Still he did not take back a word. At Nora Ellis's mercantile, he paid cash for a second bed frame, 2 straw mattresses, and a stack of blankets thick enough for Wyoming nights. Nora, a widow with flour on her sleeves and a habit of narrowing one eye whenever someone lied, looked from Caleb to Ruth, and then to Lucy clutching the carpetbag that held everything they owned. You sure about this? Nora asked. No, Caleb said. It was so honest Ruth nearly laughed, though there was no room in her for laughing just then. Nora nodded once. Then I'll throw in a kettle and another pillow. The little one's all bones. Outside, Front Street watched. Men on the boardwalk paused mid-sentence. Women behind glass turned their heads. A rancher buying an extra bed for 2 orphan sisters was the kind of thing a town could feed on for a week. Ruth helped tie the frame into the wagon, then climbed in and drew Lucy up after her. "I'll earn my keep," she said as Caleb clicked the team forward. "You'll earn what's yours," he said. "That's different." The word sat with her all the way west. The Hale place stood 12 miles out where the grass ran thin and silver and the creek bent around a low rise of cottonwoods. There was a barn with one hinge sagging, a chicken coop listing toward the wind, a dog with one torn ear asleep beneath the trough, and a house built plain and sturdy with a porch that answered every footstep in its own complaint. Lucy stared. "It's big." "It's not," Ruth said automatically. Caleb glanced back at them. "It's enough." Inside, the spare room held a washstand, a small window, and a square of late sun on the floorboards. On the far wall, near the baseboard, someone had once painted 3 blue flowers in a child's uncertain hand. They had faded almost gray. Lucy crossed to them at once. "Who made those?" Caleb stood in the doorway, one hand still on the bed frame. For a moment his face went still in a way Ruth understood at once. Grief has a look to it. Not softness. Not weakness. A kind of distance, as if part of a person is always standing in another room. "My little girl," he said. Lucy turned. "Where is she?" Ruth was about to hush her, but Caleb answered before she could. "Buried on the hill above the south pasture." No one spoke after that. The room had changed. Not chilled exactly, but deepened. That night Ruth burned the first batch of biscuits, got the second right, and watched Caleb eat as if he had spent a long time getting used to silence at his own table. Lucy nodded over her plate twice before sleep took her by force. After tucking her in beneath the new blanket, Ruth stepped onto the porch with the dish towel still in her hand. Night had fallen clean and cold. Sage and dust rode the wind. Caleb sat tipped back in a chair, boots braced on the rail, the dog curled at his feet. "You can still send us back by morning," Ruth said. He did not look at her. "Can I?" Most people are kinder in daylight than they are after thinking it over. At that he turned. Moonlight caught the lines time had cut beside his mouth. "Get some sleep, Ruth." It was not an answer, but it was not a warning either. By dawn she had water boiling, oats on, and half the kitchen sorted in her head. The hinges needed pins. The feed sacks in the shed had been stacked badly enough for rats to get bold. The ledger on the shelf beside the flower bin had loose pages stuffed into it by a man who clearly believed paperwork improved if ignored. Ruth said none of this. She simply set things right where she could. Caleb came in smelling of horse and creek water and watched her scrub the table down with hot lye and a square of old flannel. "You always work before speaking?" "Talking's never been much use to me." The corner of his mouth moved. "Fair enough." Later that morning Lucy wandered too close to the corral, just as Caleb's bay gelding spooked with a dragging rope under one hind leg. The horse reared against the rail, eyes white. Lucy froze. Ruth started toward her, but Caleb lifted one hand. "Stand," he said. He did not say it loudly. Yet both child and horse obeyed. He moved in slow, speaking nonsense under his breath, not to calm the horse so much as to give it something steady to lean on. He caught the rope with his boot, freed it, and laid his palm flat on the gelding's neck until the trembling eased. Lucy watched as if a storm had just been talked down by plain language. "You ain't scared of him?" she asked. Caleb rubbed the horse between the eyes. "Sure I am. I just don't let him know first." Lucy repeated that line 3 times before supper like she had found treasure. It was the ledger that showed Ruth the shape of the danger. While Caleb mended fence at the lower pasture, she straightened the papers by the flower bin and found a county tax notice folded beneath a feed receipt. The total did not match the figures listed below. It had been rounded upward, not by pennies, by enough to hurt. When Caleb came in, she had the paper laid flat. "You read my business often?" he asked. "Only when your business is trying to rob you." He set down his gloves. "That's so." She turned the page toward him. "County levy, road levy, school levy, grazing fee. The line items come to one number. The total claims another." He leaned over the paper, one forearm on the table, studying. "Never caught that. That's because whoever sent it expected you to trust the top line." He looked up. "And you trust none." "I trust figures. It's people who rearrange them." Lucy burst in at that moment with 3 eggs cradled in her apron. "The red hen hates me, but I still won." Caleb sat back. "That tracks." Something like ordinary life slipped through the room then, light and brief, and almost painful in how much Ruth wanted it to last. It did not. Gideon Pike rode up near dusk with Deputy Harker behind him and two ranch hands neither Ruth nor Lucy had seen before. He stayed mounted, because men like him understood the uses of height. "Thought I'd inspect the county placement," he called. "Make sure all's proper." Caleb stepped off the porch. "A man usually asks before entering my yard. A county commissioner doesn't." Ruth came to the door with Lucy behind her. Pike's gaze moved over them both and then past them to the creek meadow below the house, where the cottonwoods marked the cleanest water for miles. Only then did Ruth understand this was not about charity at all. Pike produced a folded paper. "Your note comes due. Your taxes are behind. Sign an easement giving cattle access to your lower creek in dry months, and I can see your burdens eased. The girls stay. Everyone's comfortable." Ruth spoke before Caleb could answer. "If you draw his creek in August, what keeps his grass alive?" Pike turned slowly toward her. "This is men's business. My father hauled freight and kept books," Ruth said. "The numbers don't favor him." Pike smiled thinly. "Then your father should have left you land instead of arithmetic." Lucy shrank behind Ruth. Caleb held out his hand for the paper. For one awful moment Ruth thought he meant to sign. The easy path lay right there. Ruth kept. Girls retained. Trouble delayed. Instead he tore the paper in half, then again, and let the pieces drop. Pike looked down at them. "You are choosing a hard season." Caleb's voice stayed level. "I chose it when I bought the second bed." After Pike rode off, the yard felt colder. At supper Lucy pushed peas around her plate and finally asked, "Are we in trouble?" "Yes," Ruth said, "because lying to a frightened child only teaches her to distrust kindness when it finally appears." Lucy nodded. "All right." Caleb looked from one sister to the other. "Most folks I know run from trouble." Ruth kept her eyes on the peas she was shelling into the bowl. "Most folks haven't spent a lifetime being told they were the trouble." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Some people call a woman difficult when they're angry she didn't break." Ruth's hand stilled. It was the first thing anyone had ever said to her that felt less like pity than recognition. The next afternoon Sheriff Tom Dugan stopped by. He had a pale groove where a wedding ring used to sit and a habit of rubbing it when he had to talk around his conscience. "Tread careful," he told Caleb. "Pike's got money in half this county and favors owed in the rest. You know the tax total's false." Ruth asked. Dugan glanced at her. "No ain't the same as proof." "Then I'll prove it." The sheriff rubbed the ring groove. "Mind that you stay safe while proving it." Towards sundown, two riders appeared on the north ridge, sat there long enough to be noticed, then turned back the way they came. After dark Ruth found the chain on the back gate cut clean through. "That is where I want to ask you something. If keeping your word meant risking the roof over your head, would you still keep it? If you knew the safer choice would cost someone weaker than you everything, what would you do?" I'd truly like to know, because by then the easy answers had all blown off with the dust. The first horse screamed before midnight. Ruth came awake, already moving. Caleb was in the yard with a lantern in one hand and a rifle in the other by the time she reached the kitchen. Fire climbed the barn wall in a greasy orange sheet where someone had thrown lamp oil. Horses hammered the rails. Smoke hit the back of her throat like hot metal. "Stay with Lucy," Caleb shouted. Ruth ignored him, grabbed 2 buckets, and ran for the pump. Everything after that broke into sharp pieces. Water. Fire. Hooves. Caleb cutting one mare loose, then another. The dog barking itself hoarse beneath the sparks. Lucy under the kitchen table with a wet cloth over her mouth because Ruth had shoved her there and ordered her to stay down. 2 riders streaked from the dark behind the barn. One dropped something near the trough in the scramble. Ruth snatched it up without even looking and jammed it into her apron before hauling another bucket. By the time the worst of the fire was beaten down to a smoking black ruin along the outer wall, Gideon Pike rode into the yard in a dark coat, with Deputy Harker beside him and 3 more men behind. "I came when I saw the smoke," Pike called. "Are the children safe?" Caleb turned so slowly that Ruth's skin prickled. Harker held up a paper. "Emergency removal order. The premises are unsafe. County ward to be reclaimed pending review." Ruth stepped forward at once. "Let me see." Harker almost refused, but Pike gave a little nod, amused. Ruth took the order and read by lantern light. "Seal backwards. Date wrong. Bond fee copied in the same hand as the body. Sloppy forgery. made by someone too used to obedience to bother with care. This is false, she said. Pike's expression sharpened. Careful. The clerk marks her 7s with a slash. This one doesn't. The seal's reversed, and the felines copied from a tax writ. Ruth looked up. You forged it. Take the child, Pike said softly. The yard erupted. One of Pike's men lunged for Lucy as she ran from the house. Ruth slammed into him shoulder first, tore Lucy free, and shoved her toward the porch. Another rider caught the girl around the waist and swung her across a saddle. Caleb reached them in 2 strides. Harker struck him across the temple with his pistol butt. He dropped to one knee. Go! Ruth screamed as the rider wheeled toward the gate with Lucy kicking and crying his name. Caleb was already up again. Bareback, bleeding, he vaulted onto the nearest horse and tore after them into the dark. Ruth turned back because the barn would still take the whole place if she let it. She dragged wet sacks, smothered sparks, coughed until her ribs ached, and did not stop until dawn grayed the east. Only then did she remember what she had stuffed into her apron. Inside the packet were county vouchers, feed receipts, orphanage expense sheets, and a pocket ledger in Gideon Pike's own narrow hand. She read standing in the kitchen with soot on her face and shaking fingers. Children listed as housed after they'd already been placed out. Supplies billed twice. Tax totals altered. Caleb's meadow marked for attachment after default. And one note, brief and ugly. Younger sister useful leverage if older proves troublesome. Ruth read that line twice, then a third time, because fury can make a person hope she has misunderstood. Mrs. Vale arrived at sunrise with her bonnet crooked and guilt written all over her. She took one look at Ruth's face and sat down hard on the bench. You knew, Ruth said. Not about tonight, the woman whispered. God help me, not about that. But yes, he's done it before. Threatened funding. Threatened to close the home. I kept telling myself some children were safer if I stayed quiet. Ruth held up the ledger. Then help me stop him. Where would he take her? The woman hesitated only a second. Old branding shack above Beaver Cut. Ruth saddled the gentlest horse in the yard with hands that would not stay still. Mrs. Vale tried to press coffee on her. Ruth rode without it. The cut lay north in a fold of rock where wind never seemed to leave. She found tracks easy enough once the light came strong. Caleb's horse. 2 others. One smaller, dragged a little, Lucy's boot heels. The shack came into view beneath a stand of dark pines. She heard voices before she saw them. Lucy was inside, wrists tied to a chair, cheeks streaked with tears and dust. Caleb was on one knee between her and Pike, one hand clamped over a bleeding shoulder. Harker lay by the door with blood under his nose. Pike held a revolver and wore the patient expression of a man irritated that his prey had made things untidy. He saw Ruth first. There she is, the little bookkeeper. Ruth stepped into the doorway with Caleb's dropped rifle in both hands and the ledger tucked under one arm. She had never fired anything heavier than a rabbit gun. She prayed it would not show. Let her go. Pike's glance dropped to the ledger. Whatever civility had ever lived in him left then. You should have stayed invisible. That is the safest thing a woman like you can be. Lucy's voice broke. Ruthie, don't. Caleb looked back at her once. He did not tell her to run. He did not tell her to shoot. He just looked at her as if she were part of the answer, not the problem. It nearly undid her. You have no future with those papers, Pike said. The sheriff answers to me. The judge owes me. Hand them over, and perhaps the child remains unharmed. Ruth tasted blood where she'd bitten the inside of her cheek. No, Pike sighed. Then watch him die first. The quiet inside that shack was louder than gunfire. Wind in the chinks. Rope creaking at Lucy's wrists. Caleb's breath going shallow with pain. Ruth's mind moved faster than fear now. The oil lamp on the shelf. The brand pan by the hearth. Pike's weight on his injured side from where Caleb had clearly gotten one good hit in already. She lowered the rifle an inch. Pike smiled. That was his mistake. Ruth swung the barrel sideways and smashed the lamp. Oil and flame burst across the floor between them. Pike cursed and jumped back. Caleb lunged low, hitting him at the knees. The revolver fired into the rafters. Lucy tipped her chair on purpose straight into Harker's shins. Ruth was on her in a second with the hearth knife, sawing through the rope. Can you run? Ruth shouted. Lucy nodded, sobbing. Pike reached for the ledger skidding under the cot. Ruth snatched the iron poker from the hearth and brought it down across his wrist with everything in her. Bone cracked. The gun dropped. Caleb kicked it away. Then the roof beam caught and started to burn. They stumbled outside, choking on smoke. Parker crawled after them. Pike came last, clutching his wrist and still trying to threaten them through the pain. He might yet have gotten away if Caleb, swaying with blood loss, had not seen the drag rope by the hitch rail and snapped it out on instinct. The loop caught Pike at the elbows and jerked him backward into the dirt, so hard his head struck stone. By the time Sheriff Dugan reached the shack with 2 ranch hands from town, Pike was half bound with his own tie straps and Lucy was buried in Ruth's coat, shaking from head to heel, but alive. They rode back to the ranch by noon. The smoke smell still hung over the yard. Ruth cleaned Caleb's shoulder at the kitchen table, while Lucy sat wrapped in blankets on the extra bed and refused to let either of them out of sight. When Ruth pressed the cloth to the wound, Caleb hissed, but did not pull away. "You should have stayed at the house," he said. "You should have picked a less stubborn woman." For the first time, he nearly smiled. Lucy's voice came small from the bed. "I thought he'd send me away." Ruth laid the bloodied cloth aside. "I know." Lucy looked at Caleb. "But you came back." Something changed in the room when she said it. Some lock gave way. Ruth kept her eyes on the bandage she was tying. "When Mama got sick, she made me promise I wouldn't let us be parted. Then she died, and 6 months later I signed us into county care because there was no food left and no one willing to hire a girl with a child underfoot. I've been failing that promise one day at a time ever since." Lucy made a protest, but Ruth shook her head. "No, let me say the true thing." The windmill clicked once outside. Caleb sat silent a long moment. "My wife died bringing our boy into the world," he said. "Lost the baby with her. My daughter lasted another year. Scarlet fever took what grief spared. I kept that room empty because I told myself it was respect." He looked toward the little blue flowers on the wall. "Truth is, an empty room doesn't honor the dead. It just teaches the living not to knock." Ruth tied off the bandage with hands that had finally stopped shaking. Her throat hurt for reasons that had nothing to do with smoke. "You don't owe the dead your loneliness," she said. He closed his eyes once, as if the words had struck something exact. Lucy slid from the bed and came to stand between them. She took Ruth's hand in one of hers and Caleb's in the other with all the solemnity of a child making her own covenant. "If we're saying true things," she said, "I want to stay here." Neither adult laughed. The moment was too tender for laughter. "And if this part of the story is moving you, then you are exactly who it was written for. If you want more stories about the overlooked being seen, the broken being chosen, and the cruel finally facing judgment, a like and a subscribe tells us to keep the lamp lit." By dawn, Ruth had copied every figure from Pike's ledger into Caleb's account book in her own neat hand. Mrs. Vale added dates and names. Nora Ellis brought duplicate receipts from the mercantile. Sheriff Dugan read it all, without once touching the empty groove on his finger. Foreclosure on the Hale place had been set for noon on the courthouse steps in Medicine Bow. Pike had arranged it before midnight, confident that fear would do the rest. Instead, by 11 the whole town was gathering. Pike stood on the courthouse boards with his wrists splinted and his coat buttoned high. He still looked like a man certain the world would return to its proper shape if everyone else simply remembered their place. The lawyer beside him began reading the notice of default. Ruth did not wait. "The total is false," she said. She did not shout. She only stepped forward. Yet because poor women were not expected to interrupt rich men in public, silence spread across the square at once. Pike gave her a damaged smile. "This is improper." "So is forging county orders," Ruth said. "So is billing for children already placed out. So is stealing a man's creek by inflating taxes he cannot pay." Murmurs moved through the crowd. Pike spread his good hand. "This from an orphan girl with imagination." "No," Nora Ellis called, climbing the steps with her receipt book. "From an orphan girl who can add." Mrs. Vale came next, trembling but upright. "I signed papers I should not have signed because I was afraid. That ends today." Sheriff Dugan took the ledger from Ruth and read aloud the note in Pike's own hand about Lucy being useful leverage. The words landed like stones dropped in still water. People did not gasp. They got quiet in the heavy way towns do when they realize evil has been eating at their table for years and wearing a nice vest while it did it. Ruth faced Pike then, and all the years she had been dismissed, mocked, sized up, priced low, and talked over gathered into one clean, steady voice. "Men like you count on women not counting back." You count on the poor being too tired to read the papers that bury them. You count on children being too small to testify. You were wrong. Pike lunged for the ledger. Caleb moved before anyone else. Not fast like a young man, clean like a practiced one. He caught Pike's arm, turned him, and pinned him face down against the courthouse rail while the splinted wrist gave way and the man cried out. It was not strength that won the moment. It was steadiness. The same steadiness that had bought an extra bed when everyone else had accepted the split as inevitable. Sheriff Dugan snapped irons on Pike then and there. The crowd did not cheer. It did something better. It watched him lowered step by step from the courthouse boards like a man being measured honestly for the first time in his life. Everything else followed quickly after. Harker lost his badge. The county judge, presented with forged notices and stolen funds too public now to bury, ordered Pike's accounts seized. The Hale taxes were corrected on the spot. The note was extended on fair terms. Money stolen from the orphan fund was set aside to repair the home under new oversight, with Mrs. Vale kept on only until a proper board could replace fear with decency. As for the Hale place, the barn wall got rebuilt by neighbors who arrived with hammers and awkward apologies. Nora sent pies no one had asked for. Sheriff Dugan came one Sunday with a box of nails and stayed long enough to fix the chicken coop lean. People who had once watched from windows now stepped through the gate. Late autumn came gold and sharp. Ruth put the ranch books in order, found savings where Caleb had only seen survival, and turned his winter feed purchases into something almost hopeful. Lucy learned fractions at the kitchen table and horse sense in the yard. Caleb spoke more. Not many words. Better once. The first time he kissed Ruth, it was on the porch after she had finished hanging wash in the cold, and said, almost to herself, strange thing about being wanted. You don't notice how tired you are of going without it until somebody offers it plain. He did not answer. He just stepped close enough for her to feel the heat of him through 2 layers of wool and kissed her like a man grateful for the door she had chosen to open. They married in spring under the cottonwoods by the creek Pike had nearly stolen. Lucy wore blue ribbons to match the faded flowers in her room. Caleb built shelves beneath that same window. Ruth kept the ledger in the kitchen drawer, not from fear anymore, but because she liked knowing the numbers now belonged to honest hands. 3 years later, on a June evening sweet with cut hay and warm boards, Lucy, long-legged and laughing, came running down from the hill with a basket of eggs and called that supper was getting cold. Ruth stood in the doorway with a flour-smudged cheek and Caleb behind her with their baby son asleep against his shoulder. The sun laid gold across the meadow. The creek moved clear through the cottonwoods, and the house that had once held an empty room now shone with lamplight in every window. Like the whole place had learned at last that love was never the burden people feared, only the proof that the loneliness had ended. Next time, we'll tell the story of a deaf woman sent to a remote cattle ranch because her family was ashamed of her, and the half-blind rancher who saw her worth before anyone else did.